Okay, time for reading 4 from Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard Book. In our last reading, a young boy as a baby, so this is him growing up, escapes the murder of his family by fleeing to a graveyard where two ghosts, Mr. and Mrs. Owens, take him under their wing and bring him up with the help of Silas, who has become his guardian. Silas is neither dead nor alive, lives in the graveyard, and sleeps all day and wakes all night. I think we can probably work out what kind of person he is, but he's a good man by the looks of it. The boy is named by the people in the church in the graveyard as Bod, or Nobody, and he's now being raised by ghosts in the graveyard, whilst the man who killed the rest of his family, the man Jack, is still out trying to kill him. Not sure what this picture means yet. We get a cool illustration here before chapter 2 that says, "I am the master of this place." Let's see if it comes up in today's reading. Bod was a quiet child with sober grey eyes and a mop of tousled mouse-coloured hair. He was, for the most part, obedient, does what he's told. He learned how to talk, and once he had learned, he would pester the graveyard folk with questions. "Why aren't I allowed out of the graveyard?" he would ask. "Or how do I do what he just did? Or who lives in here?" The adults would do their best to answer his questions, but their answers were often vague or confusing or contradictory. And then Bod would walk down to the old chapel and talk to Silas. He'd be there waiting at sunset, just before Silas awakened. His guardian could always be counted upon to explain matters clearly and lucidly, that means with great understanding and great simplicity, and as simple as Bod needed in order to understand. You aren't allowed out of the graveyard. It's aren't, by the way, not amped, not these days. Because it's only in the graveyard that we can keep you safe. This is where you live, and this is where those who love you can be found. Outside would not be safe for you. Not yet. You go outside every night. I'm infinitely older than you are, lad, and I'm safe wherever I am. I'm safe there too. I wish that were true, but as long as you stay here, you are safe. Or, how could you do that? How could you do that? Some skills can be attained by education, and some by practice, and some by time. Those skills will come if you study. Soon enough, you will master fading and sliding and dreamwalking. But some skills cannot be mastered by the living, and for those you must wait a little longer. Still, I do not doubt that you will acquire even those in time. You were given the freedom of the graveyard. After all, Silas would tell him, so the graveyard is taking care of you. While you are here, you can see in the darkness. You can walk some of the ways that the living should not travel. The eyes of the living will slip from you. I too was given the freedom of the graveyard, although, in my case, it comes with nothing but the right of abode. It means the right to live here. "I want to be like you," said Bod, pushing out his lower lip. "No," said Silas firmly, "you do not." Or, "Who lives there?" You know, Bod, in many cases it is written on the stone. Can you read it? Do you know your alphabet? "My what?" Silas shook his head but said nothing. Mr. and Mrs. Owens had never been much for reading when they were alive, and there was no alphabet books in the graveyard. The next night, Silas appeared in front of the Owens' cosy tomb carrying 3 large books. 2 of them brightly coloured alphabet books, A is for apple, B is for ball, and a copy of The Cat in the Hat. He also had paper and a packet of wax crayons. Then he walked Bod around the graveyard, placing the small boy's small fingers on the newest and clearest of the headstones and the plaques, and taught Bod how to find the letters of the alphabet when they appeared, beginning with the sharp steeple of the capital A. Silas gave Bod a quest to find each of the 26 letters in the graveyard, and Bod finished it proudly with the discovery of Ezekiel Umsley's stone, built into the side of the wall in the old chapel. His guardian was pleased with him. Every day Bod would take his paper and his crayons into the graveyard, and he would copy names and words and numbers as best he could. And each night before Silas would go off into the world, Bod would make Silas explain to him what he had written and make him translate the snatches of Latin which had, for the most part, baffled the Owenses. A sunny day, bumblebees explored the wildflowers that grew in the corner of the graveyard, dangling from the gorse and the bluebells, droning their deep, lazy buzz, while Bod lay in the spring sunlight watching a bronze-coloured beetle wandering across the stones of Gio, Rita, his wife Dorcas, and their son Sebastian, Fidelis ad mortem. are some of the strange Latin words that would be written on a really old tombstone. Bod had copied down their inscription, or what was said on the tombstone, and now he was only thinking about the beetle when somebody said, "Boy, what are you doing?" Bod looked up. There was someone on the other side of the gorse bush watching him. "Nothing," said Bod. He stuck out his tongue. The face on the other side of the gorse bush crumpled into a gargoyle, tongue sticking out, eyes popping, then returned to girl. "That was good," said Bod, impressed. "I can make really good faces," said the girl. "Look at this one." She pushed her nose up with one finger, creased her mouth into a huge, satisfied smile, squinted her eyes, puffed out her cheeks. "Do you know what that was?" "No." "It was a pig, silly." "Oh," Bod thought. "You mean like is for pig?" "Of course, like that. Hang on." She came round to the gorse bush and stood next to Bod, who got to his feet. She was a little older than he was, a little taller, and was dressed in bright colours, yellow and pink and orange. Bod, in his grey winding sheet, felt dowdy and drab. He's like colourless and lifeless. "How old are you?" said the girl. "What are you doing here? Do you live here? What's your name?" "I don't know," said Bod. "You don't know your name?" said the girl. "Of course you do. Everybody knows their name, fibber." "Well, I know my name," said Bod, "and I know what I'm doing here, but I don't know the other thing you said." "How old you are?" Bod nodded. "Well," said the girl, What was you when you was last birthday?" That's really again. "Well," said the girl, "What was you when you was last birthday?" "I didn't," said Bod. I never was." "Everybody gets birthdays. You mean you never had cake or candles or stuff?" Bod shook his head. The girl looked sympathetic. "Poor thing. I'm 5. I bet you're 5 too." Bod nodded enthusiastically. He was not going to argue with his new friend. She made him happy. Her name was Scarlett Amber Perkins. She told him, and she lived in a flat with no garden. Her mother was sitting on a bench at the bottom of the hill, reading a magazine, and she had told Scarlett to be back in half an hour, and to get some exercise, and not to get in any trouble or talk to strangers. "I'm a stranger," pointed out Bod. "You're not," she said defiantly. "You're a little boy." And then she said, "And you're my friend. So you can't be a stranger." Bod smiled rarely, but he smiled then, hugely and with delight. "I'm your friend," he said. "What's your name?" "Bod. It's short for nobody." She laughed. "Funny sort of name," she said. "What are you doing now?" "ABC," said Bod, "from the stones. I have to write them down." "Oh, can I do it with you?" For a moment, Bod felt protective. The gravestones were his, weren't they? And then he realised how foolish he was being. And he thought that there were things that might be more fun done in the sunlight with a friend. He said, "Yes." They copied down names from tombstones, Scarlett helping Bod pronounce unfamiliar names and words. Bod telling Scarlett what the Latin meant, if he already knew. And it seemed much too soon when they heard a voice further down the hill shouting, "Scarlett!" The girl thrust the crayons and paper back at Bod. "I gotta go," she said. "I'll see you next time," said Bod. "Won't I?" "Where do you live?" she asked. "Here," he said. And he stood and watched her as she ran down the hill. On the way home, Scarlett told her mother about the boy called Nobody who lived in the graveyard and had played with her. And that night, Scarlett's mother mentioned it to Scarlett's father, who said that he believed the imaginary friends were a common phenomenon at that age and nothing at all to be concerned about, and they were fortunate to have a nature reserve so near them. Remember, the graveyard is also a designated nature reserve. After that initial meeting, Scarlett never saw Bod first. On days when it was not raining, one of her parents would bring her to the graveyard. The parent would sit on the bench and read where Scarlett would wander off the path, a splash of fluorescent green or orange or pink, and explore. Then, always sooner rather than later, she would see a small grave face and grey eyes staring up at her from beneath a mop of mouse-coloured hair. And then Bod and she would play, hide and seek sometimes, or climbing things, or being quiet and watching the rabbits behind the old chapel. Bod would introduce Scarlett to some or other of his friends. That she could not see them did not seem to matter. She had already been told firmly by her parents that Bod was imaginary, and there was nothing at all wrong with that. Her mother had, for a few days, even insisted on laying an extra place at the dinner table for Bod, so it came as no surprise to her that Bod also had imaginary friends. He would pass on their comments to her. Bartlemy says that thou dost have a face like unto a squished plum, he would tell her. So does he. And why does he talk so funny? Doesn't he mean squashed tomato? I don't think they had tomatoes when he comes from, said Bod. And that's just how they talk. That's just how they talk then. Scarlet was happy. She was a bright, lonely child whose mother worked for a distant university teaching people she never met face to face, grading English papers sent to her over the computer, and sending messages of advice or encouragement back. Her father taught particle physics, but there were, Scarlet told Bod, too many people who wanted to teach particle physics and not enough people who wanted to learn it, so Scarlet's family had to keep moving to different university towns, and each town her father would hope for a permanent teaching position that never came. What's particle physics? Asked Bod. Scarlet shrugged. Well, she said, there's atoms, which is things that is too small to see. That's what we're all made of. And there's things that are smaller than atoms, and that's particle physics. Bod nodded and decided that Scarlet's father was probably interested in imaginary things. Bod and Scarlet wandered the graveyard together every weekday afternoon, tracing names with their fingers, writing them down. Bod would tell Scarlet whatever he knew of the inhabitants of the grave, or mausoleum, as a huge tomb type thing, or tomb, and she would tell him stories that she'd been read or learned, and sometimes she would tell him about the world outside, about cars and buses and television and aeroplanes. Bod had seen them flying high overhead and thought them loud silver birds, but had never been curious enough about them until now. He, in his turn, would tell her about the days when the people in the graves had been alive, how Sebastian Reader had been to London town and had seen the Queen, who had been a fat woman in a fur cap, who had glared at everyone and spoke no English. Sebastian Reader could not remember which queen she had been, but he did not think she had been queen for very long. When was this? Scarlet asked. He died in 1583, it says on his tombstone, so before then. Who is the oldest person here, in the whole graveyard? Asked Scarlet. Bod frowned. Probably Caius Pompeius. He came here 100 years after the Romans first got here. He told me about it. He liked the roads. So he's the oldest? I think so. Can we make a little house in one of those stone houses? You can't get in. It's all locked. They all are. Can you get in? Of course. Why can't I? The graveyard, he explained. I've got the freedom of the graveyard. It lets me go places. I want to go in the stone houses and make little houses. You can't. You're just mean. Not. Meanie. Not. Scarlet put her hands into the pocket of her anorak and walked down the hill without saying goodbye, convinced that Bod was keeping something from her, and at the same time suspecting that she was being unfair, which made her angrier. That night over dinner, she asked her mother and father if there was anyone in the country before the Romans came. Where did you hear about the Romans? Asked her father. Everybody knows, said Scarlet with withering scorn. Was there? There were Celts, said her mother. They were here. First, they go back before the Romans. They were the people that the Romans conquered. On the bench beside the old chapel, Bod was having a similar conversation. The oldest, said Silas. Honestly, Bod, I don't know. The oldest in the graveyard that I've encountered is Caius Pompeius. But there were people here before the Romans came. Lots of them, going back a long time. How are your letters coming along? Good, I think. When do I learn joined-up letters? Silas paused. I have no doubt, he said after a moment of reflection. There are among the many talented individuals interred here, at least a smattering of teachers. I shall make some inquiries. Bod was thrilled. He imagined a future in which he could read everything, in which all stories could be opened and discovered. When Silas left the graveyard to go about his own affairs, his own business, Bod walked to the willow tree beside the old chapel and called Caius Pompeius. Let's find out what they talk about tomorrow.